Okay, and welcome back. Now we're going to talk about the Incarnation, one of the key mysteries of the Christian religion. And simply put, the Incarnation is the doctrine. You might have probably have heard it before, especially if you've been around Christianity at all in your life. The doctrine that Christ is fully human and yet fully God. And now we're going to try to explore what that even means. But as we will continue to talk about this week, there's kind of an interesting thing about these mysteries, and that is they are a kind of retroversion back through the story that we've been talking about, the Christian narrative, the Bible narrative, through this whole semester or term. Because what really happens when Christianity gets to the point where it understands the Incarnation and the Trinity, or understands that to be true, and that to be the revealed truth, it now has had a revealed discovery that moves all the way back to the very, very beginning point of the story, and that is God, God's own self. And so the Incarnation and the Trinity are really about who, not what, but who God really is. And so, yes, you might be able to deduce from reality, say through the first cause argument, that a God exists, some sort of transcendent source of the world and the universe exists. But you can't deduce who that being is unless they tell you. They have to communicate themselves. Just like you can deduce that a human exists, but you don't know what human, which human, you don't know who they are. That is what Christianity believes about the Incarnation and the Trinity, is that it's the fullest revelation of who God really is, and what God intends for us, why God made us, and what God means for us to become. And so the Incarnation and the Trinity are not just things Christians believe, but rather are the foundation of the Christian religion itself. If you take these away, Christianity no longer makes sense. It's a senseless religion. And senseless religions very rarely survive. In fact, I might say senseless religions are zero. They're not around. Unless you're just one of those people who think religion is senseless, and then I don't know really what to tell you, because I just think you don't really understand religion. But anyway, so the Incarnation. Well, it starts with the resurrection. All right? The resurrection is the key to how this whole Incarnation talk even gets off the ground. In the resurrection, as we've been talking about, which is the beginning point and the foundational moment of Christianity, in the resurrection, we come to understand, Christians come to understand that God has brought his Messiah into the world, and through the resurrection is now redeeming the world, what we're going to call salvation in the next couple lectures. But Messiah was never understood to be a divine being. The notion that Messiah would be divinely appointed was always around. But there was not an understanding that Messiah would be God. Okay? So you got to remove that. There's the expectation that Messiah would be God is something Christians came up with, we would say it was real to us, but came up with to explain Jesus. And so it's not something that the Jews weren't expecting a divine being who is fully God and fully human. That took time for Christians to understand, and it begins with the resurrection. So we talked about how resurrection is the first fruits of this new creation that's coming. Well, now, as they start to think about it, they know God is moving in Jesus. And that, in fact, the resurrection proves that he's Messiah, but now he's human, but at the same time, Jesus seems to be of a different kind of being than anybody else. He forgives sins. He talks about a special relationship with his Father, who is God. He commands spiritual beings and nature not by calling on God, but by his own word. So now we know Jesus is divine, but how? And so this becomes a fight, because somehow Jesus is divine, but somehow Jesus is human. He's not a normal human because he is more powerful than other spiritual beings. But at the same time, if he's a spiritual being more powerful than other spiritual beings, he must be divine in some sense. But how? How is that possible? Somehow in Jesus, they start to realize, thinking about his ministry, thinking about what he said, because he makes statements that seem to claim that he is equal with God. His resurrection show that Christ is divine in a unique way. He's not just a magician. He's not just a sorcerer. He's not just a miracle worker. He's different. But how? Somehow in Jesus, humanity and divinity come together. And this, of course, creates an entire host of theological problems, mostly due to the view of what God is. So there's different views in the ancient world on divinity, and this, we're going to talk about a few of them that are really important, but I mean, this is very, very artificial taxonomy, okay? There's lots of views in between, and there's outliers and stuff. But the main ones you got going are kind of what we would call the pagans, and this is actually a Greek word, paganos, which means basically like, kind of like backwoods people. So that's what it means. And so it was kind of the idea that, they're generally not monotheists, they're deists at best, and they believe in many gods, and, gods of the winds, gods of the farming or agriculture, gods of death, gods of life, kind of the traditional view of polytheism. And it's obviously more complicated, and I don't want to make it sound just stupid, but, it's a kind of polytheism. And this was around. But the Greeks and the philosophers, the Romans, and these philosophers pretty much since right before Socrates, we're talking, I don't know, like 5th to 6th century BC, these philosophers start to say, hang on a tick, ein Minuten bitte, this doesn't make any sense. This really starts with Xenophanes, mixing that up with Socrates, who was in this line of thinking. And then Parmenides, and I'm glossing over a lot of philosophical history here, but they come to this view that the divine must be transcendent, and transcendent in the ways we were talking about at the beginning of the class. This God is a transcendent being that gave rise to all other being. But for them, this meant there's an interminable gap between God and the rest of creation. And in a sense, God is really just a logical principle. It's like a cosmic, mathematical almost principle of pure abstract being that gives rise to everything. But there's no meeting place between us and that being, because that being is so beyond us, it would be impossible to even begin to predicate how that could happen. And so this is kind of, Aristotle's unmoved mover. God is a thought-thinking himself. We don't know anything about God except for he's being, and he started everything going. And that's all we know. And so it's just like a logical principle or rational principle that gives rise and meaning to the world. But there's not a personal being that we can interact with. The Jews, on the other hand, had a very different belief. They had this, I don't know why sorry, the PowerPoint's all messed up, but they had this belief that, there is this omnipotent creator who brought everything into being. But I mean, the Jews started out as polytheistic like many other groups, and they came to think of God, Yahweh, as the only God. But they also have this tradition that God is personal. God does interact with them. God does speak to them. God does even change God's mind. It says God repents of things, you know? And so this doesn't totally fit with the Greek worldview, you know, the philosophical worldview of the time. And of course, these are all categories that bleed, you know, they're categories. So there's always something a bit artificial about taxonomies. You got people that are kind of combining these ideas. Philo is combining all these Greek ideas with all these Jewish ideas and trying to figure out how they can work together. And a lot of people are doing this, okay? And so the Christians come into this conversation in a really weird way because they've got this concrete human being that they're claiming explains the nature of God and actually brings together in perfect harmony this personal, covenantal natured being that is creator and yet covenantal sustainer and lover of creation, and one who interacts with humans, particularly Israel, and is in sort of a relationship of a kind of give and take with God's creation. God is in this relationship with his own creation. On the other hand, they also are bringing to bear this philosophical notion that God is transcendent and is utterly beyond and is the source of all being. Now, sorry again. And so to kind of backtrack a little bit. So as people are thinking about Jesus, these are the ideas that they have to deal with, you know? And so they're trying to figure out, what does this mean? And so they all agree he's divine in some way. Nobody thought Jesus was just a human. And I mean, again, like we talked about, he rises from the dead, claims special knowledge of the Father, claimed to do and seems to do things that only God can do. And even on occasion, it claims to be equal with God. And this debate rages for 200 years. And so several positions arose. One was docetism. This comes from the Greek word dokeo, which means basically that that Jesus he appeared. Dokeo means to seem or appear. Jesus appeared to be human, but he wasn't really human. He was a divine apparition. So he wasn't actually human. So when he appears to be crying or sleeping or eating or tired, these are just like illusions. Most of that was rejected. Then there was this Apollinarianism, which basically it's based on a guy named Apollinarius. We know very little about him, almost nothing. But he or his followers posited that God was the soul in the human body. And so, yeah, the body was eating and drinking and getting tired and stuff, but God was not in that. God was just inhabiting this body. And then when the body died, God tossed it away and went back to being celestial God. And this kind of helped explain how Jesus could appear to be human, but really just be divine, right? And then this was the most popular one. In fact, there was a time where this was popular, even more popular than what became the Orthodox view, and that was Arianism, based upon a priest named Arius, who said that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, is divine, and is the most divine being except for God the Father. And so Christ is created. Christ is not eternal. Christ does not share fully in the divine nature, but is the first creation and therefore the greatest creation. And through this creation, God made everything else. And so they kind of came up with this quip that Jesus is divine, but Jesus is not God. And so there was another quip they said was, there was a time when he was not, meaning there was a time when Jesus did not exist. Jesus was created. He was not eternal with the Father or with God's own essence or divine nature. He was created. Now, you might be thinking right now, I'm lost. This is way over my head. Well, you know what? If it weren't, I'd be a little interested, because these are deep, deep, hard questions that Christians have been wrestling with for millennia. So if you're feeling a little, that's hard, go. Okay, good. Maybe play it again. Keep reading, keep thinking, keep listening to lectures if you need to. This is hard stuff. anybody who said that studying Christianity should be easy, I don't know what the hell they're talking about. So, maybe you just gotta kind of, I don't want to say man up, because that's, misogynistic nonsense, I suppose. But you gotta come correct. Now, there was one other view, and that became the Orthodox view, and that was that Jesus was both human and God, in the fullest sense. And this is finally, for the most part, there's some historical anomalies, and this is a little too general, but basically they come to the conclusion that Jesus is fully human and fully God at a council of Nicaea, where we get the Nicene Creed from. So especially if you're like Catholic, we say the Nicene Creed at every Mass. This is later clarified, so people are like, okay, he's fully human and fully God, but what on earth does that mean? And so this is clarified at the Council of Chalcedon a little over 100 years later, and that is Jesus has two natures, a divine and human nature, in one person. And those natures, they do not confuse with each other. They do not change. They don't mix together to become something else. The divine and human natures cannot and never mix in Jesus. But they also cannot be separated or divided. They are perfectly held within Jesus. Jesus Christ, one person, has, and only Jesus Christ, in all of reality, is a person that has two natures, one human, one divine. Now, what on earth does this mean? Well, this is why it's a mystery. It's mind-boggling. And of course, why? He can't possibly be both. Well, again, there's this creator-creature distinction, but also, let's again consider the absolute attributes and the transcendentals. Do you remember the absolute attributes and transcendentals? You're supposed to. I think I might even have them on the quiz this week. In any case, they're important. Because, if you might recall, the absolute attributes are aseity. God is being from itself. God is God's own being. There's no previous cause to God. God is being pure and simple from itself. That's what aseity comes from. It comes from the Latin ase, which means from itself. God is simple. God has no parts. God did not come together from previous things to be made into something. God is just fully and actually pure act, just what God is. God is infinite. God has no bounds, no ends. God is eternal. God does not have a before or an after, a past or a future. God just purely is. No beginning, no end. And God is immutable. God does not change. God doesn't become something else. In fact, God has no need to become something else because he's perfectly who he should be. And so because of that, he is the source of the transcendentals, which are things that God is the source of and is, but we can participate in. And that, of course, is being. We have being, but we are not being itself. God is. Goodness. We can be good. We can do good things, but we are not goodness itself. God is. Truth, same thing. Beauty, same thing. Unity, same thing. We can be beautiful, but we are not beauty itself. God is. That's what it means to be God. To be God is to be the ground and source of all being. And as such, properly simple, infinite, eternal, and immutable. And if you're having a little trouble understanding this, I really would invite you to go back to the lectures. There's one or two lectures on transcendence where I really explain what all these things mean. But here's where the rub is, of course. Well, a divine nature is all these things, fine. But a human nature is not just different. A human nature is absolutely opposite of this. God is pure being, aseity. We are dependent being. We have being from another. We don't have being from itself. We have being from another. We are not simple. We are made of stuff. Stuff came together to make us. We have parts. We're not infinite. We're finite. Some of us heavier folk might be working on infinity, but we're not going to achieve it. We will have ends. We will always have a circumscription that defines our limits and separates us from other things. We are not eternal. We are temporal. We move from moment to moment to moment. And we, of course, because we do that, change. So, how are these natures held together? Well, it's a mystery. But somehow, in Jesus Christ, God, the divine nature, added the human nature to the person, and thus took on flesh, which is what incarnation means. Incarne means into flesh. Incarnem would actually be right. Into flesh in Latin. The divine, as Paul says, dwells fully in bodily form in the man Jesus Christ. And so the mystery is that without these two natures mixing together to become something else, they remain separate. Because if a divine nature mixes with a created nature, an uncreated nature mixes with a created nature, it's not uncreated anymore, right? Something new has been produced. But somehow they don't mix. They don't change. Because again, if they mix, then something new would be produced and you have a change. God doesn't change. And yet they can't be separated. They can't be divided. They are fully together in Jesus. And so we say that God is, or Jesus Christ, is fully 100% in every way, including all this stuff, divine. And yet, fully 100% in every way, including all this stuff, human. And so, in Jesus, as John says, God became flesh and dwelt among us. And why does this matter? You know, I want to just stop and think about the beauty of it for a second. I know you can get caught up on how you don't understand how it can make sense. Well, nobody does. It's not something you make sense of. It's beyond. It's mystery, like we talked about. It's beyond comprehension. And so you believe it or you don't, but you don't comprehend it. You can learn enough. We know enough to know nothing irrational is happening. If the divine and human nature mixed or changed, or was separated or divided in Jesus Christ, that would not make sense. That would be illogical. We're not saying anything illogical. But somehow within those bounds, this mystery took place, say the Christians. But the real important question, unless you're a theologian or a philosopher, I suppose, is why? Who cares? Why is this a big deal? Well, as Gregory of Nazianzus said, what is not assumed is not saved. The only way that we can be saved, say the Christians, is if God comes to us and becomes one of us. As we've been saying since the very beginning, what's the problem with the world? Humans. What's the solution? Well, in Jesus, God brings that solution fully to bear. And the problem, humanity, being added to the divine nature in Jesus, in the person Jesus Christ, becomes the solution. Why? Why is that necessary? How is that possible? That's what we'll talk about next time. See you then.